Okay, let's unpack this. Today we're taking a deep dive into some truly complex and often really emotional territory.
Mm.
The Israel-Gaza conflict.
Yeah, definitely complex.
And our sources aren't, typical research papers. Instead, we've pulled out key arguments from two, let's say, highly charged public debates.
Mm-hmm.
One features former Republican Congressman Joe Walsh, and the other involves an Israeli journalist and a government spokesperson. So quite different viewpoints there.
Very different, yeah.
Our mission today really is to try and cut through the sheer volume of noise surrounding this.
It's loud.
It is. And when you have two sides so passionately at odds, it's not always about finding, like, a single right answer.
No, rarely is.
It's more about understanding the different frameworks they're using, right? The evidence each side chooses to emphasize, and the fundamental points of contention that shape their entire perspective.
Exactly. What they even see as evidence.
Right. So you're going to hear strong arguments, you'll hear accusations, counter-accusations, and our job is just to help you navigate these intense discussions. We want to pull out the most important sort of nuggets of knowledge for you.
Mm-hmm. Help make sense of the clash.
Okay, so we're starting at the very core.
Mm.
How each side actually defines this conflict. What are the stated intentions, and, well, how do they align or maybe fiercely clash with the reality on the ground as the other side sees it?
Well, what's fascinating here, and you see it almost immediately in these debates, is how quickly the discussion circles back to the question of intent.
Intent, right.
So on one side, you have figures like Joe Walsh, the Israeli spokespeople. They argue that Israel's primary goals are absolutely clear. Eliminate Hamas, ensure Israel's security, bring back the hostages. That's the line.
That's the stated objective.
Exactly. And they even contend that if Israel truly harbored, say, genocidal intentions towards Palestinians, they could, quote, achieve it in 3 months. Yeah, there's even this striking comparison drawn to Vladimir Putin having the capacity to use a nuke in Ukraine, but choosing not to. The implication is Israel shows similar restraint.
Okay, so framing it as a choice not to do worse.
Precisely. This perspective firmly emphasizes that Israel sees itself as a moral country, fighting what they describe as a genocidal murderous organization, Hamas, in this view.
Okay, but then the counter-argument challenges that premise, like, head-on.
Completely. Critics look at the timeline, months and months of intense conflict, and they point out, well, Israel's stated goals haven't actually been fully achieved.
Right. Hamas is still there. Hostages are still held.
And crucially, they highlight that many hostages were actually released through negotiations, through ceasefires, not just military action.
That's an important point.
It is. And they also zero in on these deeply troubling statements from Israeli government members. You mentioned a deputy speaker calling Palestinian civilians scum, subhuman, or a minister suggesting nuking Gaza.
Yeah, those are hard to ignore.
For the critics, these aren't just, isolated slips of the tongue. They see them as evidence of more sinister underlying intentions that kind of contradict the claims of morality or restraint.
So the question they're posing is?
The question is, why are statements like that condemned as genocidal in other contexts, but often dismissed as just minority views or fringe opinions when they come from Israeli officials?
Yeah, that's a powerful challenge. It really spotlights this critical issue.
How do we perceive intent? Is it just about what's said, or is it about what's actually done on the ground?
Exactly. And that's where the descriptions diverge so dramatically.
Yeah.
Critics talk about Gaza suffering an apocalyptic level of destruction.
Apocalyptic.
Yeah, 70% of buildings destroyed, Gaza itself rendered uninhabitable. And then they ask, okay, what does restraint truly mean when the outcome is that kind of devastation?
It's a fair question.
But then, in stark contrast, you have Israeli representatives claiming they adhere to the gold standard in urban warfare.
The gold standard?
Yeah.
That's the phrase used. They assert they go out of their way not to target civilians and that they actively facilitate aid. So this clash over intent, it really reveals how each side is trying to define the very moral ground of the conflict.
And how that definition then dictates how they interpret every single action, every event.
Absolutely.
Okay, let's shift gears slightly, though it's deeply connected. Let's talk about the harrowing reality of civilian casualties and these grave accusations of war crimes.
Yeah, this is where the debates get particularly intense, and understandably so.
Both sides present starkly different accounts, different interpretations.
Very stark. And you see critics bringing forward these specific, highly emotional examples that, they really hit hard.
Like what?
Well, they detail the case of Hind Rajab. She was a 6-year-old girl, allegedly killed with her family and the paramedics who tried to save them by an Israeli tank. And the reports mention 335 bullets fired into their car.
335.
Yeah, it's an astonishing number. They also cite the fact that 200 children have been killed in the West Bank since October 7th. These incidents, for the critics, are presented as clear instances of war crimes.
Not mistakes, but deliberate acts.
Yes, a deliberate killing of civilians, which, carries severe implications under international humanitarian law. They explicitly say this isn't just a mistake.
Okay. So how does the pro-Israel side respond to those kinds of specific, horrific allegations?
Well, they do acknowledge that, quote, mistakes are made in every war. That phrase comes up.
Right.
But they adamantly maintain these are not reflective of Israel's policy or intent. They consistently place the lion's share of the blame, as they put it, on Hamas for starting the war on October 7th, knowing exactly what would happen.
So blaming Hamas for the consequences of Israel's response.
Essentially, yes.
Hmm.
They argue that Hamas intentionally hides behind their civilians, putting their civilians in harm's way. This accusation of using human shields, which is itself a deeply contentious issue under international law, comes up constantly. The assertion is Hamas does this all the time, and therefore it's not Israel's policy to target civilians, but Hamas forces their hand, basically.
But this issue of human shields, it's not entirely one-sided in the debate, is it?
No, it's not. While Hamas is consistently accused of it, critics, for their part, point to Israeli press reports from within Israel that allege instances of Israeli forces themselves using, for example, an 80-year-old Palestinian man as a human shield.
Right. I think I saw those reports.
Yeah, and even sending Palestinians into tunnels first. So it highlights this kind of painful symmetry in the accusations, even if the scale might be different.
Okay. And what about the aid situation, the starvation? That's another huge point of conflict.
A massive one, extremely urgent. Critics quote Cindy McCain, who heads the World Food Program, stating very clearly that people are starving and that Israel is blocking aid.
Blocking aid. That's a direct accusation.
A very direct accusation from a major international figure. Now, the Israeli side concedes that starvation is occurring, which is significant in itself.
They admit it's happening.
Yes, but they insist they have gone out of their way to allow aid in. Their argument is that Hamas is responsible for robbing aid trucks, diverting supplies from the population that needs them.
So again, blame shifted to Hamas.
Right, and this deep, almost visceral disagreement over these fundamentals, who's responsible for civilian deaths, who's responsible for the hunger, it really forms the very heart of the conflict's moral battleground.
Yeah.
It's incredibly polarized.
So given these wildly diverging accounts, these completely opposite narratives, what does this mean for actually verifying what's happening? When stories differ so drastically, how do we, or how does anyone, assess the credibility of information, and what role do international bodies even play in this?
Yeah, this is where the debate gets particularly sharp, I'd say. It really exposes a fundamental distrust, often in established institutions.
How so?
Well, critics lean heavily on major international bodies. They cite the UN, the International Criminal Court, the ICC, the World Health Organization, WHO, Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch.
The big names.
The big names, exactly. Plus, leading Israeli Holocaust scholars, interestingly, they argue that all of these groups have, in various ways, accused Israel of war crimes, of using starvation tactics, some even using the term genocide.
And the ICC has actually brought charges.
Yes, the ICC has formally charged Israeli leaders with things like willful killing of civilians and starvation, and there was even an Israeli Holocaust survivor and judge acting as an advisor on that. So for critics, these aren't just opinions, they're authoritative sources corroborating their claims.
Okay, that seems pretty weighty. But now, here's where the narratives, as you said, truly diverge.
Massively. Because the pro-Israel stance often involves dismissing these very same international organizations.
Dismissing the UN, the ICC.
Absolutely. Claiming they have an inherent anti-Israel bias. That's the core argument against them. They'll openly call reports from groups like Amnesty a bunch of liars and lies. They refuse to trust the UN. The argument often goes, you wouldn't take ISIS's word for it, so why Hamas's, kind of equating the UN sources with Hamas.
Wow, that's a strong comparison.
It is. And crucially, they also reject the casualty figures coming from the Palestinian Health Ministry in Gaza. They equate accepting those figures with taking al-Qaeda at face value.
Even though other bodies vouch for those figures.
Exactly. Despite the fact that the UN and the WHO have consistently said, in this conflict and in past ones, that those ministry figures, while needing verification, have generally proven reliable over time.
So this battle over credibility, it's not just about the facts themselves, it's about Who gets to say what the facts are?
Precisely. It's a fight for the legitimacy of the entire narrative.
Yeah.
It highlights this huge challenge. How do you establish a universally accepted truth in such a fiercely polarized, information-contested environment?
Yeah. And what about transparency, like specific claims versus proof?
Well, that's another key area. The Israeli side asserts, for example, they've killed 13,000 Hamas terrorists.
Okay, a specific number.
Yes, but critics immediately demand concrete proof. They point out that while Israel gives a total number, the Palestinian Health Ministry has actually published detailed lists of the casualties they've recorded. Names, ages, ID numbers.
A difference in methodology, at least in what's made public.
A significant difference in transparency, critics would argue. Another big issue is press access to Gaza.
Right. Independent journalists have had a hard time getting in.
Extremely hard. Israeli officials defend this, citing it as an active war zone. They also claim, sometimes, that some Palestinian journalists are active Hamas operatives.
Which is a serious accusation.
Very serious. But critics argue this lack of access severely obstructs the world from seeing what's truly happening on the ground beyond the narratives controlled by the belligerents.
It prevents independent verification.
Exactly. And then there was that whole situation with UNRWA, the UN Agency for Palestinian Refugees. Remember the claims that some of their employees took part in the October 7th attacks?
Yeah, that caused a huge funding crisis for them.
It did. Many donor countries cut aid immediately based on Israel's initial dossier. But interestingly, most of those countries have since reinstated the funding,
Implying what?
implying perhaps a degree of skepticism about the evidence that was initially presented, or at least that the issue wasn't as widespread as first portrayed. So this whole back and forth about who controls information, whose information you can trust, it's just a core element of this entire debate.
Okay, finally, let's look ahead. Let's talk about the proposed paths forward. What does each side actually envision for Gaza, for the broader region? And why do they seem to believe their vision is the only viable way to achieve peace? This is where, the aspirational goals meet some pretty harsh realities.
Definitely. So the Israeli perspective, as presented in these debates, focuses very intently on a future where Hamas is gone, removed politically, removed militarily.
Total elimination.
That's the goal. They talk about Gaza being rebuilt into a much better place. There's even talk of de-radicalization, drawing parallels to post-World War II Germany.
Re-education, essentially.
Something like that. However, when the spokesperson was pressed specifically on who would pay for the reconstruction, the damage estimated at something like $18.2 billion.
A huge sum.
Immense. They declined to make a commitment on Israel paying for it. So this vision, while it sounds like a new beginning, it really rests heavily on the complete eradication of an ideology, which, well, history shows that's an incredibly difficult thing to achieve.
Yeah, you can't just bomb an idea out of existence.
Pretty much. Now, on the other side, critics highlight what they see as a deeply unsettling long-term pattern.
True.
They argue the Israeli government has been steadily driving Palestinians from their homes not just now, but for decades in both the West Bank and Gaza.
So connecting current events to a longer history.
Exactly. And they ask whether these actions cumulatively amount to ethnic cleansing or apartheid. Those are heavy terms, loaded with historical and legal weight.
Extremely loaded.
And they strongly challenge the idea that achieving peace is solely or even primarily all on the Palestinians. They point to Israeli leaders, like Netanyahu specifically, who they say have openly bragged about blocking peace and actively worked against the establishment of a Palestinian state for decades.
So, arguing that Israeli policy itself is a major obstacle.
A fundamental obstacle. For these critics, true peace just cannot exist without addressing what they see as the underlying issues. Displacement, the ongoing occupation, the lack of equality, issues they believe are systemically perpetuated by the Israeli state.
That brings us right to the core question then.
Yeah.
Long-term solutions. It sounds like one side believes peace absolutely hinges on Hamas being gone and Palestinians accepting Israel's terms.
Yeah, right. That's broadly the stance.
While the other argues for a total change in approach, questioning if the occupation itself, the inequality, can ever lead to peace.
Exactly. Which makes any common ground seem almost impossible. But what was genuinely surprising, almost unheard of, really, in this type of pro-Israel debate,
What was that?
it was Joe Walsh, the former Republican congressman. He actually suggested a one-state solution.
Walsh suggested that. Really?
Yeah. He proposed that all people living in what he called a bigger Israel, explicitly including Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza, should have equal rights and, crucially, voting rights.
even if that meant Jews might eventually be outnumbered.
He acknowledged that possibility, yes, equal rights for everyone under one state. It was, well, a fascinating, completely unexpected idea coming from someone otherwise strongly defending Israel's actions in the conflict.
Well, that certainly underscores the desperate search for any viable path forward, doesn't it?
It really does. It suggests that maybe for some, the desire for a lasting peace, any kind of lasting peace, might even start to transcend some of those really long-held traditional political positions, even from within their own camp.
Something really challenging the status quo there.
Definitely.
So, reflecting on all this, what does it all mean for you listening in? We've navigated two incredibly intense debates here. We've uncovered these vastly different narratives, the deeply personal convictions driving them, and the specific facts and counterfacts each side uses to frame this conflict.
Hmm.
And you can clearly hear, I think, how the arguments aren't just about, spreadsheets of data. They're about intent, about morality, about the very definition of loaded terms like war crime and even genocide.
Yeah, and what's truly illuminating or maybe sobering isn't just the disagreement itself, it's seeing how deeply ingrained certain beliefs are, how information gets filtered or sometimes just outright dismissed based on perspectives that were already there.
Confirmation bias on a grand scale.
You could say that it's a powerful reminder, really, that being well-informed isn't just about consuming facts passively. It's about actively understanding the frameworks through which those facts are presented to you, especially maybe when you have two people, two sides, debating so fiercely over the very reality of a situation.
Absolutely. So for you, our learner, maybe think about what stands out most from this deep dive. How do these clashing viewpoints shape or maybe reshape your own understanding of the conflict?
Yeah, and perhaps more importantly, how do they illuminate the profound challenges, maybe the near impossibility sometimes, of finding common ground when even the basic premises of a discussion are so fiercely contested?
Definitely something to mull over as you continue your own journey to being truly well-informed.